The dust settled on Main Street like a blanket of judgment as Catherine Walsh stepped down from the stagecoach, her worn leather boots meeting the sun, baked earth of Redemption Creek. She was 38 years old, and in the unforgiving arithmetic of the frontier, that made her ancient for a mail-order bride. The advertisement had been clear enough, calling for women of good character to come west and marry the ranchers and cowboys who had carved civilization from wilderness. What it hadn't mentioned was that youth was the currency most valued, and Catherine's account had run dry years ago. She stood there in the afternoon heat, clutching a small carpet bag that contained everything she owned in this world. Her dress was clean but faded, mended in places where the fabric had given way to time and use. The other women who had arrived on the coach were already being greeted by eager men, their faces bright with hope and nervous excitement. Catherine watched as one by one they were claimed, like parcels finally reaching their destination. She remained on the platform, her heart sinking with each passing moment, feeling the weight of every eye that glanced her way, and then quickly looked elsewhere. The town matchmaker, a stout woman named Mrs. Henderson who ran the boarding house, approached with a forced smile that couldn't quite hide the concern in her eyes. She had seen this before, though rarely with someone as old as Catherine. The harsh truth of the frontier was that men wanted young wives who could bear many children and work the land for decades to come. Catherine understood this without being told. She had known the risk when she left St. Louis, but desperation had a way of making even the longest odds seem worth taking. "Miss Walsh," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice professionally cheerful, "why don't you come inside and have some refreshment? The men will be gathering shortly for the social hour." It was a kind lie. Catherine could see in the woman's eyes that no one would be coming for her. She had traveled 1,500 miles to be unwanted, to be passed over, to be reminded once again that her value had expired somewhere between her 20th and 30th year. The boarding house parlor smelled of lemon oil and hope. The younger women fluttered about like birds, adjusting their hair and pinching their cheeks for color. Catherine sat in a corner chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the parade of men as they arrived. Cowboys with sun-weathered faces and careful manners. Ranchers with property and prospects. Even a banker, though he seemed more interested in inventory than romance. Each man entered with anticipation, scanned the room with calculating eyes, and settled on one of the younger women. Not one looked at Catherine for more than a moment before moving on. She tried not to let the humiliation show on her face. She had been beautiful once, or so she'd been told. But beauty was a flower that bloomed and faded, and hers had wilted years ago under the weight of hardship and loss. Her husband had died of cholera when she was 25, leaving her with nothing but debts and a baby girl she had named Emma. The baby had lived only 6 weeks, taking with her the last of Catherine's youth, and leaving behind a grief so profound it had carved lines into her face that no amount of smiling could erase. The evening wore on with excruciating slowness. One by one, the younger women paired off with prospective husbands, their laughter filling the room like music Catherine could no longer hear. Mrs. Henderson tried to mask her concern, but Catherine could see the calculations happening behind the woman's eyes. A mail-order bride who remained unclaimed was a burden, a failed investment, a problem without an easy solution. As the parlor emptied and lamplight replaced sunlight, Catherine finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She had spent her last $20 on the stagecoach fare. She had no family to return to, no prospects in St. Louis except the laundry where she had worked 14-hour days for pennies. She had bet everything on this chance, and she had lost. The frontier had no use for old, barren women. She was as unwanted here as she had been back east, only now she was stranded 1,500 miles from anything familiar. "Perhaps in the morning," Mrs. Henderson said softly, though they both knew morning would bring no miracles. "You're welcome to stay the night, dear. We'll sort something out." It was charity, and Catherine hated accepting it, but she had no choice. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. That night, lying on a narrow bed in a room no bigger than a closet, Catherine wept silently into her pillow. She thought of Emma, of the daughter she had lost 13 years ago, of the life she might have had if fate had been kinder. She thought of her husband, dead before he'd turned 30, buried in a pauper's grave because they couldn't afford anything better. She thought of all the dreams that had died slowly over the years, until she'd been left with nothing but this one desperate hope, now crushed like everything else. The next morning brought no reprieve. Catherine helped Mrs. Henderson with breakfast, earning her keep the only way she knew how. The remaining brides had all been claimed or had made arrangements. Catherine alone remained, a leftover, an afterthought. Several townswomen stopped by with suggestions that were thinly veiled dismissals. Perhaps she could work as a seamstress. Perhaps the schoolhouse needed cleaning. Perhaps she could return east on the next stagecoach, though everyone knew she had no money for passage. It was the third day when everything changed, though it started with more of the same disappointment. A rancher named Thomas Brennan had arrived in town looking for a wife. He was a widower in his early 40s, owner of a substantial spread about 10 miles north of Redemption Creek. He had 2 ranch hands, 100 head of cattle, and according to Mrs. Henderson, a desperate need for a woman's touch around his homestead. He was also, Catherine soon learned, as particular as every other man who had passed her by. Thomas Brennan was tall and lean, with hands roughened by rope and labor. His face was honest, carved by sun and wind into something that spoke of hard work and integrity. When Mrs. Henderson introduced Catherine, he was polite but distant. His eyes traveled over her with the same assessing look she had endured dozens of times, measuring her worth and finding it insufficient. She saw the disappointment flash across his face, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the barely perceptible shake of his head. "I was hoping for someone younger," he said quietly to Mrs. Henderson, as though Catherine weren't standing right there. "Someone who could give me sons. Someone who could keep up with the work." It was the same refrain Catherine had heard in a dozen different variations. She felt something inside her harden, a protective shell forming around what remained of her heart. Mrs. Henderson began her practice speech about Catherine's good character and strong work ethic, but Thomas raised a hand to stop her. "I'm sure she's a fine woman," he said, "but she's not what I'm looking for. I need a wife who can help me build a legacy, not someone who's already past her prime." The words stung even though Catherine had heard worse. She stood there, silent and still, refusing to let him see how deeply his rejection cut. Thomas turned to leave, his decision made, but he paused at the door as Mrs. Henderson called after him. "Mr. Brennan, there are no other women available. Miss Walsh is the only bride left, and she's a widow herself. She understands loss. She understands hard work. She's not some fragile girl who'll wilt at the first hardship." He looked back at Catherine, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "But I need to think of my future. I need sons to help run the ranch. I need—" He stopped, shook his head, and walked out into the morning sun. Catherine felt the last of her hope drain away. If a man as desperate as Thomas Brennan wouldn't take her, then no one would. She was finished. Her journey west had been for nothing. She would have to find some way to survive in this town that had no place for her, doing whatever work she could find, living on the margins of a society that had already decided she had nothing left to offer. That afternoon, Catherine walked through Redemption Creek, trying to form some kind of plan. The town was small but growing, built around the promise of cattle ranching and the railroad that would eventually connect it to the larger world. The buildings were new, some still smelling of fresh, cut lumber. The streets were wide and dusty, lined with hitching posts and water troughs. Cowboys and ranchers moved about their business with purposeful strides, while women in calico dresses gossiped outside the general store. Catherine felt like a ghost drifting through a world where she didn't belong. She passed the saloon, where piano music drifted out through the swinging doors. She passed the church, a simple white building with a cross that seemed to reach toward heaven with eternal optimism. She passed the schoolhouse, where children's voices rose in unison, reciting their lessons. Each place was a reminder of normal life, of the community she would never truly be part of. She found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The land stretched endlessly before her, brown and vast and beautiful in its stark emptiness. She stood there for a long time, letting the wind pull at her skirts and hair, trying to find the strength to face another day of rejection and uncertainty. It was there that she heard the crying. Soft at first, almost lost in the sound of the wind, but growing more distinct as Catherine listened. She looked around and saw a small figure huddled behind a water trough near the livery stable. It was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, with tangled dark hair and a dirty face streaked with tears. She wore a simple dress that had once been blue, but was now faded and torn, and her feet were bare despite the rough ground. Catherine approached slowly, not wanting to frighten the child. "Hello there," she said softly, kneeling down to the girl's level. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Are you hurt?" The little girl looked up with eyes so full of pain and loneliness that Catherine felt her heart break open all over again. Those eyes held something familiar, a grief that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "I can't find my mama," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been looking and looking, but I can't find her." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting clean paths through the dirt. Catherine felt a surge of protective instinct, so strong it almost knocked her backward. Without thinking, she gathered the child into her arms, holding her close as the little girl sobbed against her shoulder. "It's all right," Catherine murmured, stroking the tangled hair. "We'll find her. Don't you worry. We'll find your mama." But as Catherine carried the girl back toward town, asking passersby if they knew the child, a troubling picture began to emerge. The girl's name was Sarah, and she had been living at the edge of town in a tiny shack with her mother, Maria, who had worked as a laundress. 2 weeks ago, Maria had collapsed while working and died within hours. The town doctor suspected her heart had simply given out, worn down by years of poverty and overwork. Sarah had been alone since then, fending for herself, too frightened and confused to ask for help. "Why hasn't anyone taken her in?" Catherine asked Mrs. Henderson, her voice sharp with anger when she brought Sarah to the boarding house. How could everyone just leave a child alone like that? Mrs. Henderson's face flushed with shame. "There was some talk of finding her a place," she admitted. "The Reverend's wife mentioned the orphanage in Silver City, but that's 3 days' ride from here. I suppose everyone thought someone else would handle it. You know how these things go. Everyone's busy with their own troubles." Catherine looked down at Sarah, who clung to her skirts with both hands, those haunted eyes watching the adults with fear and distrust. "She's a child," Catherine said quietly, but with steel underneath. Not some inconvenient problem to be passed along to someone else. That night, Catherine gave Sarah her own bed and slept in a chair beside her. The girl had barely spoken since they'd arrived at the boarding house, but she wouldn't let Catherine out of her sight. When Catherine tried to step away, Sarah's hand shot out, gripping her sleeve with desperate strength. So Catherine stayed, watching the child sleep fitfully, seeing her own lost Emma in every troubled breath. In the morning, Mrs. Henderson approached Catherine with obvious reluctance. "The town council met last night," she said. "They've agreed to pay for Sarah's passage to the orphanage in Silver City. There's a family there that might take her in. It's for the best, really. The child needs a proper home." "No." The word came out of Catherine's mouth before she had time to think. "Absolutely not. She's not going to any orphanage." Mrs. Henderson blinked in surprise. "But Miss Walsh, what else can be done? You're not in a position to take her yourself. You don't even have a home here." Catherine looked at Sarah, who was sitting at the breakfast table, pushing porridge around her bowl without eating. The girl's shoulders were hunched, her body curled in on itself as though trying to take up as little space as possible. Catherine saw herself in that posture, saw all the time she had tried to make herself small and invisible, hoping that would be enough to survive. "I'll find a way," Catherine said firmly. "I'll work. I'll take any job. But that child is not going to be shipped off to strangers who will see her as just another mouth to feed." But finding work proved as difficult as finding a husband. The seamstress didn't need help. The general store already had a clerk. The saloon offered her work as a serving girl. But Catherine knew what that position often entailed, and she wouldn't expose Sarah to that environment. Day after day, she searched for opportunities, growing more desperate as their welcome at the boarding house wore thin. It was on the 5th day that Thomas Brennan returned to town. Catherine saw him from the boarding house window, riding his horse down Main Street with the easy confidence of a man who belonged. She turned away quickly, not wanting to see the reminder of her rejection, but Sarah had noticed him too. The little girl pressed her face against the window, watching as Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her voice showing the first hint of curiosity Catherine had heard from her. "Just a rancher," Catherine said, trying to keep her tone neutral. No one important. But Sarah kept watching, and when Thomas emerged from the store with his supplies, the girl suddenly grabbed Catherine's hand. "Can we go outside?" she asked. "Please. I want to see the horses." Catherine couldn't refuse her. They went outside, Sarah holding tight to Catherine's hand, and as they passed the general store, Thomas looked up. His eyes went first to Catherine, then down to the small girl beside her. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of surprise followed by something else, something harder to read. "Miss Walsh," he said, tipping his hat politely. His gaze lingered on Sarah, taking in the child's thin frame and worn clothing, the way she stayed pressed against Catherine's side. "Or Miss Deckard, Brennan," Catherine replied coolly, preparing to walk past him. She had no interest in another conversation about her inadequacies. But Sarah stopped, tugging on Catherine's hand. The little girl looked up at Thomas with those enormous, sorrowful eyes, and then she looked at Catherine, and then back at Thomas. Catherine felt the child's grip tighten, felt her whole body tense. "Mister," Sarah said, her voice small but clear, "do you need a mama?" The question hung in the air, strange and innocent and devastating all at once. Thomas looked confused, glancing at Catherine as though she might explain. But before Catherine could speak, before she could apologize for the child's forwardness, Sarah continued, "Because she needs someone to need her," Sarah said, pointing up at Catherine. "She's real good. She found me when I was lost. She holds me when I have bad dreams. She knows how to make the hurt less." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "My mama died, and everyone said I had to go away, but she said no. She said she'd find a way to keep me. That's what mamas do. They find ways." Thomas stared at the child, then at Catherine, and something in his face began to crack open. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, with the vulnerability of having her situation laid bare by a 5-year-old's honest words. "Sarah," Catherine said gently, "Miss Detter. Brennan doesn't need." "That's her," Sarah interrupted, her voice suddenly urgent, pulling at Catherine's hand. "That's my mama. Not the one who died. I loved her, but she's gone. But that's her. That's the one who stayed when everyone else wanted me gone. That's my mama." Catherine's vision blurred with sudden tears. She knelt down and pulled Sarah into her arms, holding her tight, not caring that Thomas was watching, not caring about anything except this fierce, fragile child who had claimed her when no one else would. Thomas cleared his throat, and when Catherine looked up, she saw that his eyes were suspiciously bright. He crouched down so he was at Sarah's level. "Your mama seems like a pretty special lady," he said quietly. "Tell me, what else does she do?" Sarah wiped her nose on her sleeve. "She tells me stories about a baby named Emma who watches over us from heaven. She sings songs that make me forget the scary stuff. She braids my hair even though it tangles real bad. She says I'm not a burden, even though I know that's what everyone thinks." "You're not a burden," Thomas said firmly. "Any man who gets to have you in his life would be lucky." He stood up slowly, his eyes meeting Catherine's over Sarah's head. "Miss Walsh, might I have a word with you? In private." Catherine felt her heart hammer in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, but she nodded, asking Mrs. Henderson to watch Sarah for a moment. They walked a short distance down the street, stopping near the church, where they could talk without being overheard. "I was wrong," Thomas said without preamble. When I met you, all I could see was what I thought I needed. A young wife, more children, some fantasy of the future I'd built in my head. He looked down at his hands, weathered and strong. My wife died 3 years ago. Childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. I've been alone since then, telling myself I needed to find someone who could give me sons, who could help me build a dynasty. He laughed bitterly. What a fool I've been. Catherine waited, not trusting herself to speak. That little girl. Thomas continued. The way she looks at you, the way she trusts you, that's worth more than all the sons in the world. And the way you look at her, like you'd fight the whole territory to keep her safe, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. He met her eyes directly. I'm not a romantic man, Miss Walsh. I can't promise you passion or poetry, but I can promise you a home. A place where you and Sarah would be safe and wanted. A chance to build something real. Catherine's throat tightened. Why? She whispered. Why now? What changed? That child changed everything, Thomas said simply. She said you stayed when everyone wanted her gone. Well, everyone wanted you gone too, didn't they? Everyone passed you by because you weren't young enough, or pretty enough, or whatever nonsense we tell ourselves matters. But you're strong enough to fight for an orphan nobody wanted. You're brave enough to choose love over convenience. That's the kind of woman I need. That's the kind of woman I want. I can't give you children, Catherine said, the words catching in her throat. After Emma died, something broke inside me. The doctor said I'd never carry another child. You already have a child. Thomas replied. Sarah needs a mother, and from what I can see, she's already chosen you. Maybe that's how families are supposed to work. Not by blood, but by choice. By showing up and staying when things get hard. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face, but they were different from the tears she'd cried in recent days. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope she'd thought was dead forever. I don't love you, she said honestly. I barely know you. I don't love you either, Thomas said with a gentle smile. But I respect you and I admire you, and I think that might be a better foundation than love anyway. The rest, if it comes, will come in time. What matters is that we're both choosing this with clear eyes. No illusions, no fairy tales. Just two people who've known loss, offering each other a chance at something better. They walked back to the boarding house together, and when Sarah saw them approaching, she ran to Catherine, throwing her small arms around her waist. Catherine picked her up, feeling the solid weight of the child in her arms, and looked at Thomas over Sarah's shoulder. There's something you should know, she said. I'm not easy to live with. I have nightmares. I have days when the grief is so heavy I can barely move. I'm stubborn and proud and I don't always know when to ask for help. Good, Thomas said. Because I'm not easy to live with either. I'm set in my ways. I work too much. I forget to talk about my feelings until they build up and explode. We'll probably drive each other crazy. Sarah looked between them, her eyes wide. Does this mean we get to stay together? She asked, her voice trembling with hope. Thomas nodded. If your mama agrees to marry me, then yes, we all get to stay together. Sarah looked up at Catherine. Are you my mama? Really and truly. Catherine pressed her lips to the top of Sarah's head, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the fierce protection that surged through her veins. Really and truly, she whispered. If you'll have me, I'll have you, Sarah said solemnly. You're exactly what I needed. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small white church at the edge of town. Catherine wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson helped her make, nothing fancy, but clean and new. Sarah stood beside her in a dress they'd bought at the general store, her hair freshly washed and braided, a ribbon tied at the end. Thomas wore his Sunday best, his hair combed back, his hands trembling slightly as he took Catherine's hand. The Reverend spoke about love and commitment, and the mysterious ways that life brings people together. Catherine barely heard the words. She was too focused on the weight of Sarah's hand in hers, on the solid presence of Thomas beside her, on the strange, unexpected gift of this second chance. When it was time to exchange vows, Thomas spoke first. I promise to give you and Sarah a home, he said. I promise to work hard and provide for you both. I promise to listen, even when it's difficult, and to show up, even when I'd rather hide. I promise to value what we're building here, this family we're choosing to become." Catherine's voice shook when she responded. "I promise to be a partner to you, not just a wife. I promise to care for your home and your land as if they were my own. I promise to be honest, even when the truth is hard. And I promise to love this child with everything I have, to be the mother she deserves." Sarah, who wasn't technically part of the ceremony, suddenly spoke up. "I promise to be good," she said earnestly, "and to help with chores. And to remember that families stay together even when things are hard." There wasn't a dry eye in the church, which was fuller than anyone had expected. The townspeople who had ignored Catherine just days before now watched with something like shame and admiration mingled together. They saw in her something they had missed, something that Sarah had recognized immediately: strength that didn't announce itself, courage that looked like stubbornness, love that manifested as fierce, unshakable commitment. After the ceremony, they rode out to Thomas's ranch in a wagon loaded with Catherine and Sarah's few possessions. The ranch house was simple but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a large main room with a fireplace. The land around it stretched for miles, brown grass bending under an endless sky. It was beautiful in a stark, honest way that matched how Catherine felt about her new life. That first night, after Sarah had been tucked into bed in the small room that would be hers, Catherine and Thomas sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the prairie night. Crickets sang in the darkness. Somewhere a coyote called to its pack. The stars overhead were brighter than Catherine had ever seen, unpolluted by city lights, ancient and patient. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked after a long silence. Catherine considered the question. "I'm thinking that I came west expecting one thing and found something completely different. I thought I needed someone to choose me, to validate my worth. But really I needed to choose something for myself. I needed to choose Sarah, and in doing that, I found my way here. She's a special child," Thomas said. "Losing her mother so young, surviving on her own like that. She's tougher than she looks. She reminds me of my Emma," Catherine admitted. "My daughter who died. Sometimes I look at Sarah, and I feel like I've been given a second chance to be a mother. Like maybe all that grief wasn't meaningless." Thomas reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "We're all getting second chances here," he said. "Me too. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was wrong. You and Sarah are teaching me that family isn't about bloodlines or perfect plans. It's about showing up and doing the work day after day." Inside the house, Sarah called out, her voice thick with sleep. Catherine rose immediately, going to the child's bedside. Sarah reached up, her small hand finding Catherine's face in the darkness. "You're still here?" she whispered. "I'm still here," Catherine confirmed. "And I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after. That's what mamas do. We stay." Sarah smiled and closed her eyes, already drifting back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. Catherine watched her for a long moment, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settle around her shoulders like a blanket. When she returned to the porch, Thomas had brought out 2 cups of coffee. They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping the bitter liquid, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. They were strangers still, in many ways, but they were strangers who had chosen to build something together, who had seen in each other the possibility of healing. The weeks that followed were not easy. Catherine had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, had to understand how to manage a household in this harsh environment. She had to earn the respect of the 2 ranch hands who worked for Thomas, had to prove that she wasn't just some city woman playing at frontier life. She burned meals and made mistakes, and had days when she wanted to give up. But Sarah was there, following her around like a shadow, helping in her small ways, reminding Catherine why she had fought so hard to stay. And Thomas was there too, patient and steady, teaching her what she needed to know without making her feel foolish for not knowing it already. Slowly, against all odds, they became a family. Not the family any of them had planned for, but perhaps the family they all needed. Thomas discovered that Catherine had a head for numbers and let her take over the ranch's bookkeeping. Catherine discovered that Thomas had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. Sarah bloomed under their combined attention, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. 6 months after the wedding, on a cool autumn evening, the three of them sat together at the dinner table. Sarah was chattering about a bird she'd seen that day, describing its colors with the elaborate detail only a child could muster. Thomas was listening with genuine interest, asking questions and encouraging her storytelling. Catherine watched them both, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. This was happiness, she realized, not the grand, sweeping kind she'd imagined as a young woman, but something quieter and more durable. It was the satisfaction of hard work done well. It was the comfort of knowing you had people who needed you and whom you needed in return. It was the peace of finally having a place where you belonged. After Sarah went to bed, Thomas and Catherine found themselves alone on the porch again, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Taking on both of us when you could have waited for someone younger." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Not for a single second," he finally said. "You want to know what I regret? I regret every day that I walked around thinking I knew what I needed. I regret the years I wasted believing that having sons was more important than having a family. I regret almost missing out on this, because I was too stubborn to see what was right in front of me." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that still felt new but increasingly natural. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. For seeing Sarah. For giving us a chance when no one else would." Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You've got it backward," he said. "You gave me the chance. You took a bitter, lonely man and showed him that life could still hold surprises. You brought joy back into this house. You made it a home." They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Inside the house, Sarah slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she had parents who loved her. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the endless tasks that came with frontier life. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, this sense of having found something precious and rare. Catherine thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off that stagecoach 6 months ago. She had been so certain that her worth was determined by whether a man chose her, by whether she could fulfill some predetermined role. She had felt old and used up, past her prime unwanted. But Sarah had seen something different. Sarah had looked at her and seen a mother, had recognized strength where everyone else saw only age and failure. In the end, it wasn't a man who had validated Catherine's worth. It was a small girl who needed someone to fight for her, and in fighting for Sarah, Catherine had reclaimed herself. She had remembered that her value didn't come from being young or pretty or useful in conventional ways. It came from her capacity to love fiercely, to show up when it mattered, to choose courage over comfort. And Thomas had learned his own lesson. He had discovered that the future he had planned wasn't the future he actually needed. He had been building walls without noticing how empty the space inside had become. Catherine and Sarah had filled that emptiness, not with the dynasty he'd imagined, but with something better: connection, purpose, and the daily practice of caring for people who depended on him. The frontier had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing what really mattered. Out here, where survival required cooperation and strength came in many forms, there was no room for the artificial hierarchies of civilized society. A woman's worth wasn't measured by her age or her ability to bear children. It was measured by her willingness to work, to contribute, to stand firm when the winds tried to knock her down. As winter approached and the first frost touched the prairie grass, Catherine stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching Sarah play outside. The girl was chasing chickens, her laughter ringing across the yard, her face flushed with health and happiness. Thomas was working in the barn. his steady presence a constant in their lives. And Catherine, who had thought her story was over, realized that it was just beginning. She was no longer the unwanted bride who had been passed over by every man in town. She was no longer defined by what she lacked or what time had taken from her. She was a mother, a wife, a partner in building something meaningful. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. That evening, as they gathered for dinner, Sarah said grace before the meal. "Thank you for this food," she prayed in her small, serious voice. "Thank you for this house. Thank you for my mama and papa, who wanted me even when no one else did. And thank you for making us a family, even though we're not the regular kind. Amen. Amen," Catherine and Thomas echoed, their voices blending together. As they ate, sharing stories about their day, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. The road that had brought her here had been hard, paved with loss and disappointment and moments when she'd wanted to give up. But every hardship had been necessary. Every rejection had pushed her toward this moment, this family, this life. She looked at Sarah, who was now her daughter in every way that mattered. She looked at Thomas, who had become her partner and friend and perhaps, in time, something more. She looked around at the simple home they were building together, at the life they were creating from the ruins of their separate losses. This was redemption, Catherine thought. Not in the grand, dramatic sense, but in the quiet, daily practice of choosing to keep going, of refusing to let circumstances define you, of remaining open to unexpected grace. Redemption Creek had earned its name after all. This small frontier town had become the place where three broken people found their way to wholeness, where rejection transformed into belonging, where endings became beginnings. And it had all started with a little girl who looked past age and circumstances and saw only what mattered, a heart brave enough to love when love was most needed. Sarah had claimed Catherine as her mama, and in doing so, had given them all permission to claim each other, to build a family not bound by blood, but forged by choice, by commitment, by the simple, powerful act of showing up for each other, day after day, in all the small ways that mattered most.